Do you want to kick us off?
Well, good morning and good morning again to the people who were there at the keynote. It's great to have you here. I'm Janet Lane with the Canada West Foundation, doing research into workforce development and skills and competency issues. I'm really happy to be part of the group that is promoting this idea of building adaptive and resilient cities. David is a co-author and probably one of the lead instigators in this idea, and so it's been a delight to get to know him and to work with him on this project. And I'll hand it over to you, David.
Yeah, and Wellington, why don't you introduce yourself as well?
Certainly. I'm Wellington Holdbrook. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of ConnectFirst Credit Union, but my background would be over 25 years of investing in through private equity, venture capital, lending, you name it, in small and mid-sized businesses, certainly an area that I would consider my sweet spot.
Perfect. So the three of us are going to be facilitating a city session. Depending upon where the numbers land, we may break into breakout groups, or if we're going to hang in the 20 range, I think it's probably just as easy for us all just to hang and facilitate a conversation. We're going to walk through a presentation that reflects on this concept of an open learning system and how it builds on Janet's presentation and keynote from this morning around the transformation that's going to happen and is happening within the learning system right now. But very much specifically, we're going to focus this conversation on two major themes: the nature of open learning and the transformative and disruptive impact it will have on every role in the system, whether you're a learner, whether you're an educator, or whether you're playing a co-creative role in the middle. Then we're going to have Janet really talk about a mechanism to start delivering that. And that is going to be focusing on this idea of a city level or community competency framework, which is quite transformative if we can scale it at a city level. So Janet, keep an eye if you could. Are you able to see how many people are participating or how many people are engaged? If you can, that would be awesome. And we can then make a judgment call at what point we want to breakout or not. So I would encourage everyone, if you went to learningscity.ca is hosts two reports that were released in June of this year. They were done collaboratively across multiple institutions, researchers from University of Calgary, SAIT, Mount Royal, and Alberta University Arts in conjunction with Calgary Economic Development, and it really focused on this question of how does the city change. And this project was initiated over a year ago, or a year and a half ago. So as you could imagine, in March when the pandemic hit and the entire economic system and learning system were shut down, it really accelerated and frankly brought into reality the inevitable transformation that's going to happen. And it really has led to accelerating the conversation at a city level. So I'm going to talk just to spend a little while about kind of framing out this idea of what open learning is. And I frame it by looking back in history and looking at the very nature of what's called open innovation and some of the seismic changes we've seen over the last 15 years, and specifically in the technology sector, but how that will, we believe, inform us on where we're going to go. It's not a question of if in my mind, it's only a question of when and how fast. And that brings us back to culture, the individual culture as well as institutional level culture. So back in August of 2008, I like to tell the story of BlackBerry, which I suspect vast majority of people have heard of, and maybe even some of us had. Back in 2008, BlackBerry had 55% market share. And then the iPhone was launched. A wonderful quote from the co-CEOs the day the iPhone was launched that the reality is BlackBerry has a killer competitive advantage called a keyboard. Okay. What that didn't recognize is the keyboard was reflecting a historical view of competitive advantage, a historical view of wants and needs. Whereas what Apple and Steve Jobs specifically looked at isn't where the puck was, it's where the puck will be going. And with that launched the iPhone, and obviously Google launched the Android, and then right now A mere 12 years later, but it really only took about 5 years. BlackBerry is basically at a zero market share. It's technically at 0.002%, but I'm writing it down to zero. So it underwent seismic loss of market share and collapsed as a company. So the question is why? Okay, and how does that inform us as a city, and how does that inform us as a learning system? So BlackBerry was based on a very historical model called closed innovation. It's the model that, frankly, Microsoft evolved from, Apple evolved from, and BlackBerry built their entire business model on, which basically said, we own the hardware, we control the software, we will then build everything that will exist on the hardware and software. We will then sell it to our customers. They are going to be pure consumers of our product, but we fundamentally are in control. What open innovation says is, in fact, it moves into this model, which we've heard, called co-creation, in which there are multiple different organizations and groups that are unleashed to, in fact, create value in the system. It moves from a very closed model to an open model. And so when Steve Jobs launched, first of all, it was obviously iTunes, then it moved into this concept of an app store and has obviously expanded dramatically since then. He unleashed and said, you know what? It's not economic or realistic for Apple to go hire 10,000 software engineers to start trying to prepare and develop apps that will sit on this platform. Instead, in a co-creation economic model, I'm going to give 75% of all the revenue for anyone who creates apps for my device to the app developer. And I will take 25% as Apple through the App Store, essentially as a distribution channel. And the device becomes an open platform for innovation. So what did that do? It transformed consumers to not only become the consumers and users of the product, but they also then became developers because they could identify the opportunities and needs more effectively at a street level. And I always tell the story of a kid in New Brunswick who was 12 back in about 2010, said, hey, we need for junior high a more efficient tool for managing our homework, and developed in about 24 hours an app for junior high homework management and sold thousands of them, taking home his cut of 75%. So the model essentially unleashes the power of people to become not only consumers, but co-creators of the products. So what did that do? So with the launch of the iPhone and the App Store back in 2008, they started with 500 apps. As of today, as of yesterday, it sits at 2.2 million apps in the App Store, as well as 2.8 million apps loaded in Google Play. There are 20 million registered iOS developers. Again, limited barrier to entry to become an iOS developer. There are 202 billion apps downloaded every single year. So that was the 2019 data. And what's interesting about this, and it speaks to Janet's concept of the speed of change, is 82% of the apps have a very limited shelf life. They come and go in less than 90 days. And this feeds into the speed of change. And one of the things that is critical as we start looking at the evolution of the learning system is where we came from. And one of the stories I tell is, when we look at the development of the television as an example of an old, very traditional linear development system, the original concept for television came out about 1890 and was commercialized in the late 1940s. It was commercialized in a very linear, a bunch of white men sitting at Bell Labs in white coats, developed it over a 50-year period and hoped somebody would come, right? Sure enough, back in the 50s, they discovered this idea of soap operas and sponsorship and found somebody to develop content and actually found consumers that would actually buy a product called a television and subscribe to it ultimately. So that took somewhere around, 60 years door to door to develop the television. An app today, on average, is launched in 72 hours. Okay. Wellington comes up with an idea, and by the end of the week, it's going to be in market. Whether it's going to work is actually irrelevant. Whether the market needs it is irrelevant, because what he's going to get in the first week is feedback. So the customers, the users of the app will become co-creators, because next Wednesday, he will launch version 2.0 and go from there. This idea of an iteration and co-creation process is going to be transformative for learning. So let's then take this idea of open innovation and closed innovation and say, what's the model today? So the traditional learning system today fundamentally is a closed system, right? We all join kindergarten somewhere around grade when we're 5 years old. We then sit on the old conveyor belt called elementary school, go to junior high, go to high school. Then somebody says you should think about maybe going to post-secondary, and 3 out of 4 of us generally do. You slide through the system, then you pop out like the television and say, I hope someone's prepared to buy me. After investing just in post-secondary alone, 4 years, about 10,000 hours of your life, and about $70,000, which the average student in Alberta graduates with a $30,000 debt. So that is the closed system. We hope the consumer, which ultimately will be an employer of some type, wants the features and benefits that the system developed. The employer plays a relatively limited role in developing the products, as opposed to the app. They're a consumer almost exclusively. So the system right now sits with about 294,000 students in Calgary. And these are the different formal accredited institutions that exist. There's about 402, if I recall, formally accredited institutions, and another 1,600 other forms of recognized learning in the city. So let's think about what an open learning system looks like. As Janet talked about this morning, an open learning system explodes it. It recognizes that on a going forward basis, the idea of learning is not a life stage, it runs horizontal, it's about life. It starts probably far earlier than age of 5, certainly, and continues far beyond this idea of ending at the end of university. It also then moves us far beyond a classroom. That is a small part of the idea of a learning system. The classrooms and books are a component of it, but it's a relatively small component as we start looking at the other parts of a society and community being co-creators. So employers are no longer exclusively consumers. They are part of the learning system because they are co-creators. They are then mentoring and coaching students through aggressive integration of work integrated learning into our program. Community programming, whether it be at the YMCA or whether it be through sports or arts or culture, are all now recognized as part of this learning system because it develops incredibly important skills. Obviously, professional associations continue to be engaged in the process, and they're probably the only form right now where the employer has an influence on actual curriculum to a great extent. On the right here are just a series of examples of how the system will explode very quickly. So one of the interesting conversations at a city level is the city likes to think we're not in learning. Why? Because around 1867, the British North America Act said education is a responsibility of the province. It sets up in Edmonton with a ministry. Therefore, the city doesn't get is not involved in learning. My sole answer to that is really because let's look at your library system. Let's look at the investments across arts. Let's look at your investments across technology. The city is one of the most significant investors in learning, but few would recognize that, and it's not embedded in the system. It sits in isolation. So here's an example of where the system explodes. We go from a small rounding error of accredited institutions to an explosion of just under 155,000 organizations that are going to now be engaged in the learning system. So if it's on the right, those are the 20 million app developers that are now developing apps for Google Play and for Apple. So the role of an employer like Wellington, the role of a volunteer hockey coach becomes fundamentally different because the things they do with their employees, the skills they develop, foundational, what we call enabling skills, will either create the capacity for an individual and ultimately organizations in the city to adapt, or it'll constrain it. And this idea of exploding this responsibility into this open co-creation model has a huge amount of structural problems. And I'd like to use the analogy, one of the big analogies I like to look at is the idea of money and currency, right? So this is my little clip art. This is the evolution of currency, the evolution of financial currency, where Thousands of years ago, we used to barter cows and horses, or livestock, or other types of resources, and trade those. There was an efficiency problem with that. We then moved into a commodity currency, trading gold and silver, that then ultimately moved into what we call proto currencies. So that was seashells. Seashells all of a sudden had a value because they would be representative and portable and recognize some shared level of exchange without me actually having to cut a horse in half or a cow in half, which is the divisible problem. Ultimately, that matured over the last few hundred years into forms of national currency. In the last 50 years, we introduced the concept of credit. And what we're seeing now is the evolution of electronic currency through mechanisms such as Bitcoin. So, what's the point of that? The point of that is financial currency has some core dimensions that evolved over thousands of years. It's fundamentally based on trust. If you look at the US currency, what does it say? In God we trust, which is actually code word for the Federal Reserve that secures the financial value of that exchange, right? It's a mechanism to trade and exchange shared value. I recognize that dollar's worth X. You recognize that dollar's worth X. There's a level of stability and portability with that. So all of a sudden, I can exchange money without actually having to turn it into a horse. It's based on scarcity. Scarcity creates the stability. So there's a supply and demand for that currency. And therefore, that ensures that that dollar I bought today is going to be worth $1 next week. And the stable value of it is critical, because why would I give you $1 now if it's only going to be worth 20 cents next week? And obviously, this is the hyperinflation problem seen in many countries. So here's an example of inefficiency. This is a map of Europe prior to the euro. If anyone traveled prior to 1999, this is what they had to do. Go to Switzerland, currency. Go to France, currency exchange. The people making money in this were the currency traders. As you went to Holland, you went to Belgium. Every time you got on a train, you likely had to go to currency exchange to trade money. Highly inefficient at a consumer level. And so this is Europe today. They've moved to the euro in the late 1990s. That's been adopted by the majority of what called the Eurozone countries, and a long list of other countries that want to join that mechanism. Why? Because it's easy. It creates all the benefits of a consistent currency exchange because of recognized and shared value. So what on earth does this have to do with the idea of competency? Well, we need to start looking at competencies, which is again skills and knowledge, as a form of currency. When you move from a market that produces somewhere around 500 institutions generate the currency called competencies, and then they need to be in exchange with 150,000 different organizations called employers in Calgary, there's absolutely no shared value. All the benefits of currency that were discovered back in the early days, thousands of years ago, we are incredibly primitive. We sit in what I would call a competency currency, somewhere just after a mere barter, right? Right after the early stages of currency. We don't have the portability, we don't have the shared value, we don't have the ability to exchange across systems. That creates a capacity problem because we are highly inefficient when it comes to exchange of value, right? Again, limited trust in the competency. Janet tells me she's got excellent interpersonal skills. It's not secured. There's no one supporting it. There's not verified. How do I know that, right? There's no consistency. Janet thinks she's an excellent writer, but there's no, in fact, measure of her writing skills relative to others. Absolutely limited portability. Wellington, at his organization, may have certain skills that he learned through professional development, but how do you port that? The limited portability exists right now is in a proxy of some form of post-secondary accreditation or some form of professional accreditation. Its value remains based on scarcity. If you can demonstrate you have skills, it's of higher value today. But there's limited stability with that because domain-specific skills, as Janet talked about, has a shelf life of between 5 and 6 years. So you go something that's extremely high value to something of extremely low value overnight. And this is what Calgary is facing right now. So I'm going to hand over to Janet because this sets up the problem and how the idea of a Calgary Community Competency Framework can start moving us into a Euro type model for creating a common framework to exchange currency value.
Thanks, David. So now you've set it up for us as to just how difficult this is going to be. You've set the stage, and we know the extent of the problem, but we've got some parts of the solution. What we hope to do here is to start a conversation about how we can co-create together the solution, because it's a big elephant right now. What are the bite-sized pieces that we can take to get us where we need to be? So let's go back. David, you're going to have to forward the slides. Can you see me? Okay. All right. So let's go back to some of the things I talked about this little in my keynote this morning, and what David has already talked briefly about. What we're advocating is an open learning system where learners and all learning is supported by the system. You get to learn what you want, when you want, how you want to learn it. You can learn all kinds of competencies, the domain-specific skills that are the technical skills of a job that are not as transferable, and the enabling competencies, which are those underlying skills, sometimes called the essential skills, that are underlie everything else and are very transferable. And hopefully what you're doing when you're in your learning journey is that you're building on your aptitudes as well as your interests, because you're going to succeed at the things that you've got the most aptitude for. And let's face it, we can't all be gaming app developers or YouTube system posters. There's got to be more to life than what a lot of the young people are telling me they're interested in. And so when we move on and we start thinking about what are the components, what are the skills, what are the tools that we need to do this work, to think about creating this open learning system. Well, as David has alluded, we can't do it until we know what the competencies are. And competencies are the knowledge, skills, and attributes needed to complete the tasks of a job. It's not enough to just have skill. You have to know why you're using that skill, how you're going to use that skill, why you wouldn't use it another way. You have to know when to use it, when not to use it. So there's a whole lot more that you have to bring to the job than just the particular skill. And once we know what those competencies are, we can build competency frameworks. Next slide. And the frameworks are this three-dimensional model. So you've got jobs across one axis of the dimension, one dimension. All the jobs in the economy. Let's think about it as citywide, all the jobs in the city. Well, okay, maybe that's just a little too big. So all the kinds of jobs in the city. And then all the competencies that it takes to build those, to do the job well. And it'll be everything from communication skills and writing skills, although David, I don't ever think that I'm an expert in writing. It's very hard work. But then, so all of those enabling competencies plus those domain-specific competencies. And then as you go up the ladder in your career, you'll be working in more management competencies and more leadership competencies, although there is something to be said for having leadership competencies right from being in your childhood. And then this level of competence, because some jobs only require you to have a little bit, and other jobs need you to have a whole heck of a lot of a particular competency. Next slide. So these competencies are modular, stackable, and transferable. Some of them are more transferable than others. Some of them you would need to adjust your knowledge base to be able to apply the skill in a new situation. So, and next slide. So as I mentioned, these skills come in different bundles. There's two different kinds really that are useful. And I think the next slide, David. Okay, so yeah, let's just look a little bit more at these enabling competencies, because these are the ones that are going to be learned in the workplace. It starts in school. It starts in the home. I mean, we learn to communicate. We learn to learn. We learn to solve problems when we're very small children in the home. But then we build on those skills when we're going through education and when we go into our jobs. You know, McDonald's is one of the biggest first job providers in North America, probably in the world. And they know that what they're doing is they're teaching people how to communicate, how to solve problems, and most importantly, how to work in teams. And if you've ever been behind the counter in a McDonald's, and I only got to do it for an hour, you know that there's a dance going on back there. They are learning to work in teams. So these are the enabling competencies that help us to apply the domain specific skills to globally competitive advantage. And
So
moving
moving just
on.
that on to that, Jen, real quick. One of the challenges in the system right now is accountability for the development of enabling competencies.
Mhm.
So most of the school systems, when you look at their learning outcomes, somewhere around right through elementary school, through junior high, through parts of high school, there's an emphasis on obviously these enabling competencies, and there's measurements tied to it. And then we flip the model. And most post-secondary institutions are structured around what Jan will talk about around domain-specific competencies. There's professors in physics, there's professors in accounting, I'm a professor in marketing. Um, I have no accountability or responsibility to develop any enabling skills. I have no measurement tied to it. If I can fit it into my class, wonderful. This lack of development of the accountability in the system for enabling competencies restricts our capacity to adapt. Yeah.
Right.
Okay.
And in fact, part of the work that I'm doing when I'm not doing this work is I'm working with the government of Canada and a bunch of other collaborators, and we're working on helping to develop some of those measurements, so that because you can't be accountable if you don't know how to measure, and you can't. And as you were saying earlier, David, you want to have some currency behind this, right? You can't just say, yeah, I think you're an excellent writer, or yeah, you passed this course because you were able to use Excel or Word and write a decent document. So you have to have criteria for measurement. And that's why when we talk about a competency framework for Calgary, I'm going to spend a little bit of time on that. So we know that we have to know what the competencies are. Well, how are we going to figure those out? In Calgary, we have to talk to employers. Employers are the consumers of the skills, but the economy benefits from the product of those skills. And so what post-secondaries need to understand is that their consumer is not really the student. They think that, but their consumer is the whole economy, right? And if we open up this learning system, then we're going to have more people involved in knowing that they're part of the learning ecosystem. We won't be putting it all back on the shoulders of the post-secondary system. We'll be putting it on the shoulders of all of us. And to get there, to build that competency framework, we need to have an understanding of what those competencies are from the people who are using those competencies to produce the goods and services in the economy. And we need to know from them what level of competence they need. And those skills, those competencies are going to be both domain specific and enabling competencies. So when you think about a competency framework for Calgary, it's going to have all of those skills in there, all of those competencies in there. And we're going to have an understanding that some of these skills are best taught in David's marketing class or in SAIT's automotive classes or in any of those formal education pieces. But we're also going to start to realize that some of these competencies, as David alluded, are built by the Calgary Public Library or Momentum or the Further Education Society or a whole bunch of other learning providers. And then we have to get it into the employers. And so, you know, that last slide talked about how to build a learning culture. And I go back to this because I think Daniel Pink had it right way back in 2009. autonomy, mastery, and purpose gives people the agency to want to be part of a learning culture. Employers used to hire, train, motivate, and with any luck, they'd retain. But now we need to be thinking about employers being part of that learning system. So they hire, train, motivate, retain, and then co-create this whole learning system. We shouldn't worry so much about people being poached and moving, like the employers have said in the past, if I train them, they'll just leave. And the answer to that is, well, what happens if you don't train them and they stay? We're going to have to do training and learning on the job as a continuous piece so that we can co-create the enabling competencies that help us to move across jobs within this learning ecosystem and within the city of Calgary, and then eventually perhaps to link our competency framework with other competency frameworks across the country. Imagine how exciting that could be. I'm going to pass it off now to Wellington because Wellington's got some views as an employer about what this means for him.
Thank you very much, Janet. And I know we don't have a lot of time, so I'm going to be relatively quick. But I think it's a really interesting framework that you've both presented to us. And one of the components that I really liked is the notion of these enabling skills that we need the next workforce to really bring. But one of the challenges we've got is as we're creating more adaptable workforce through the right kind of learning framework, we need to have more adaptable business models to catch these people coming into the economy, coming into the workplace. And quite frankly, one of the biggest challenges I think we as a nation have, and certainly we have here in Alberta, is a lot of the businesses that have been very successful here in the past have become very successful through very rigid business models. And as a result, a lot of those businesses have been very much tested in the last year as we've faced COVID, for example, where we've got businesses based on very, very high fixed cost structures that have been required to really scramble to move to more flexible cost structures to move more effectively with the market from a perspective of just survivability. But it's a heartbreaking thing we see all the time when people graduate from university, they graduate from college, they go get their first job, and then they're put in a box. And they're stuck in that box. And kind of to your point, Janet, we sort of contain them there till they stop being that flexible, that adaptive worker that we need to grow our businesses into the long term. So I think my point here is just that we need to be building a business culture that is more adaptable too. And that includes a culture that is going to embrace failure and embrace iteration and embrace constant learning so that we can build success for that economy in the longer term and a more resilient Calgary, ultimately. But I won't say more than that to save what time we have left here for our discussion.
Sure, let's open it up for a conversation around, what we're interested in is really the participants in the discussion group right here. What's your role? Whether it be professionally, whether it be in your community, volunteering, what role do you play in this new open learning system? Do you view yourself as an educator if you're a hockey coach, or a Girl Guide leader or what have you? And how do we start formalizing this as part of a standardized framework so you can start conveying the value of those experiences and how they contribute to competency development?
David, we've got 24, so I've asked Randy for 2 chat rooms.
Yeah.
Okay.
All right. Jen, do you have...
Whoops. Janet and David. Good.
Okay.
Just solve the world's problems. We're good.
Well, we didn't have enough time to solve the world's problems, David. But we did have a little bit of a chat about the need for everybody to now start thinking. This is the problem with conferences like this, right? We don't have a lot of time, but it gets the head thinking. And so, the few of the ideas that came out of our session was that everybody now gets the chance to go back to their own world, not just their world of work, but the other organizations that they are involved in, and think about how can they be part of this system.
And I could just Megan raised a question, and this is a concern we hear often. And we encourage it to be literally what I call it's got to flip the lens. Is one of the challenges is, oh my God, how do we fix the system? How do we fix our city? How do we fix our organization? I'm like, let's not go there. Fixing a university is a generational problem. Fixing an organization is likely that as well. But if you break it down and say, how do I fix my kids? How do I fix myself?
Please tell me.
This is breaking it. That's where if you go look at some of the reports, and again, we wrote a book called designu.ca, which is truly about design. It's available for free at designu.ca, but it's all focused on designing the individual, because an adaptive city and adaptive organizations are composed of adaptive individuals. It's never top down. It's always bottom up. So think about it on a very micro level.
Wellington, anything to add?
I know we're running out of time. I just really have enjoyed being part of this conversation. I really enjoyed the breakout, and we got a lot of work to do, guys.
If I could just add one comment, Wellington raised a really important notion and why it reflects the system. He's like, we're not teaching enough, and what we don't have enough of, and I see this all the time, I agree with you, is grit, right? Grit is about, I call it the bounce back. Failure and the resiliency to bounce back. We don't teach that in a classroom. You teach that on a field, on the ice, in a dance studio, right? We have to, in fact, that's why grit has to be embedded in the system, but the system has to be reframed.
Wow. Oh, great point there, David. Thanks very much. You see in the chat there's the link back to Swapcard, or you can go right to Swapcard. We'll have the closing session in about a minute. Thank you all. Thank you, Janet, David, Wellington, for sharing your ideas and thoughts. Thank you all as well, too, for the rest of the participants being part of this breakout session. We'll see you back in the main session.